Hi everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Postgraduate Workers' Rights National Campaign and Petition. My name is Thomas Deneen. I am a third year PhD candidate at Trinity College Dublin. I'm also the chair of the TCD Postgraduate Workers Alliance, and delighted to bring the talk to you here today. We've got a great lineup of speakers: Maria Delaney from Noteworthy.ie and Eddie Conlon from TUI. Just want to welcome everyone here today, and particularly welcome those who haven't been involved in the postgraduate workers' rights movement so far and are looking to get involved, especially those from HEIs who don't have a postgraduate workers alliance so far. So I'll just get kicked off here. You able to share the screen there, Connor? Sorry. Cheers, thanks. Yeah, so this is a picture from our launch day, which was outside the Department of Education. And you can see here members from the branches from the UCD Postgraduate Workers Alliance and the TCD Postgraduate Workers Alliance, but we also had people on the NUIG campus as well. So, sorry. I suppose, yeah, the question is why postgraduate workers' rights? Well, I suppose there's a lot of issues, but two of the main ones really that we need to focus on are pay and employee rights. So on the left-hand side here, we have the relationship between minimum wage and PhD income. Now, this doesn't include other postgraduate workers, such as master students that do teaching, but if we just focus now on PhDs, in Ireland, the average PhD income is below the minimum wage when compared to our European counterparts. And we can see as well, the countries which have workers' rights are paid far higher than those who do not. And this is a real struggle for Irish PhDs, many of which can't make their rent, can't make essential bills. And it's just a further annoyance on top of the stress of your PhD. And then if we look at the increase in non-permanent and casual lecturing staff across institutions, so this is from the Noteworthy .ie series on academic uncertainty by Maria Delaney, we can see the increase in non-permanent and casual lecturing staff in UCD and a heavy reliance as well on casual staff in TCD. Now, this also includes casual staff being postdocs as well as PhDs and masters teaching assistants. And these are two of the biggest issues because when you are a casual worker, you aren't guaranteed certain rights that an employee would be guaranteed, such as contracts of employment and other benefits. And this obviously creates a large amount of precarity for those workers. But there's a huge amount of other issues on top of this, especially for, say, researchers with disabilities, researchers from non-EU countries, which are like openly discriminated against in our system, and other issues like maternity and maternity leave. So what's really the solution here? The solution is postgraduate workers' rights, simple as. And we've come together as a coalition of 4 workers' alliances from TCD, UCD, NUIG, and UCC to put together this charter for postgraduate workers' rights and reform. I'm just going to take you through a few of the points. This is the charter that's on our petition, so a link is on our Twitter. If you want to go sign that petition, we'd encourage you to do so. The more signatures, the more likely we are to get a hearing before the Department of Higher Ed on this. So, firstly, the recognition of PhD researchers as workers with employee status, contracts of employment, collective bargaining rights, and public pension contributions. Contracts should cover research, childcare, administrative work, and it should also include paid maternity, paternity, and sick leave. A real issue actually is that there is no maternity and paternity and sick leave for PhDs, which is in 2021 just absolutely ridiculous. Our second point is to do with PhD salaries. So, just to specify that PhD research salaries should not be below the living income in the city where the PhD researcher is based. The current system uh, is where a PhD will apply for a scholarship or some funding, and where they are based is not taken into account in Ireland. So, if you're on an SFI funded scholarship, you will get paid the same if you're based in Dublin or if you're based in Galway or any other part of the country, even though the cost of living are starkly different between those areas. And in the UK, they've dealt with this very well. Wellcome Trust scholarships, they will give extra money to those working in London as opposed to any other part of the UK. But more should be done here. There should also be a budget for personal equipment included in that as well for all state funded PhD research positions. So no one should have to go buy a laptop or other things like books, etc. Uh, our third point is regarding unpaid teaching and the work that postgraduates do. That includes PhDs and master's students. So we want to see an end to unpaid teaching and the recognition of all postgraduates performing teaching, research, and pastoral work as workers with employee rights, uh, contracts of employment, collective bargaining rights, public pay contributions as well, pension contributions as well. Our fourth point is provision of an access to appropriate training sports, resources, and facilities for all postgraduates performing teaching work and pastoral work. So this year has really highlighted this because of the transition to online teaching, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of postgraduates have to change their teaching from face-to-face to online teaching. However, certainly in the case of Trinity, there was no training for this. There was no standards. A lot of that responsibility fell on the shoulders of that postgraduate, and that's just completely wrong. And it's not only not beneficial to the PhD or the teaching assistant, it's not beneficial to the students as well. Our fifth point is clear governance and transparency both within HEIs and the Higher Education Authority in decision making regarding matters relating to PhD and postgraduate workers. Again, this was really highlighted by the pandemic, where decisions were made on behalf of PhDs and postgraduate workers, whether that was regarding the new systems that were put in place in their HEIs or to do with return to work procedures. No PhD or postgraduate were consulted in some of those processes, which led to situations where postgraduates who are researching couldn't even access a lunchroom, they couldn't access toilets, etc. So it's really important that those key stakeholders in research are also involved in the in decision-making processes. But we'd also like to see the establishment of an independent ombudsman within the HEA to ensure compliance with these regulations, contractual responsibilities, and to act as mediator for any disputes that may arise as well. Our sixth point, we want to see an end to discrimination against non-EU PhD researchers. We want to see the abolishment of special non-EU fees. We want to see the abolishment of discriminatory point system for state scholarship applications. We want to see security of immigration status for all, adequate funding that covers all non-EU immigration costs, and that includes visas and Garda vetting, access to public health care, paid maternity, paternity, and sick leave as well. This year during the pandemic as well, we've seen a hike in insurance premiums on non-EU PhD researchers, which is just disgraceful. They're researchers like any other researcher in the institute, and they shouldn't be, pay a levy for it. Point 7, we want clear information about welfare and housing support entitlements for PhD researchers, and where applicable, the extension of these schemes should include PhD researchers as well. Point 8, we want to see the allocation of affordable HEI-owned student accommodation for postgraduates proportional to the HEI's postgraduate population, and the rent charged for that accommodation should be no more than a third of the average PhD researcher income. And the accommodation should also be fit for housing PhD researchers with families. You know, there's plenty of PhD researchers in the country that have families or are expecting children, etc., and they should also be accommodated for as well. And then our final point, just a general point on an end to precarity in higher education and research. We want to see the establishment of clear and secure career pathways for all workers in higher education and research. And point 10, we want to see improved access and support for all who wish to pursue postgraduate research and teaching positions. So that includes dramatic increases to funding, disability services, to ensure HEIs are compliant with both the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2006 and the Equal Status Act 2000, ensuring compliance with the Athena Swan Charter in all HEIs, restoring funding to HEI health and mental health services pre-2008 levels, and expanding those services to allow for universal free healthcare for all staff and students. So that's our charter, and these are our branches. So we have a branch in TCD, UCD, NUIG, and UCC. If you're interested in getting involved in this campaign, please get in touch with us if you are in our institute. If not, please get in touch with us anyways, because we'd love to start setting up branches across Ireland. We've had interest from most HEIs at this stage, but we would really like to see more branches set up across the country and to really drive this home. And we want to see, of course, more people signing our petition and more people getting involved. So that was my introduction. And yeah, so we've got two great speakers here today. Firstly, Maria Delaney, who's a journalist at Noteworthy. She's also the president of the Irish Science and Technology Journalists Association, and she's the author of the Academic Uncertainty series. If you have not read that series already, please do read it. It's really an eye-opener into, you know, the levels of academic precarity and uncertainty, and there's a whole section about PhD researchers, how we are effectively workers but have no working status. Our second speaker today is Eddie Conlon, who is a lecturer and trade union activist. He's a lecturer in the School of Multidisciplinary Technologies at TUD, and he is a long-time member of the Teachers Union of Ireland. I just ask that if anyone has any questions, please put them into the chat and we will flag them and ask them to our speakers here today. So yeah, without further ado, I'll just welcome Maria to talk. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I'm from Noteworthy, as Tom was saying, and thanks very much for that introduction. And so Noteworthy, just to give you a bit of background, it's a crowd-funded investigative platform by Journal Media, which is also the public publishers of the journal.ie. And what we do is we ask people for ideas for investigations, and then we put together proposals based on ideas and then crowdfund them. So just to give you an idea of some of the proposals that we have on the site at the moment, we just published a big investigation on non-denominational school options for parents this week, and that was by Peter McGuire, one of our freelance reporters. And we also have things on the environment and rehab and health and different various things that we crowdfund, and some of them are almost funded. And so for this investigation, Academic Uncertainty, we crowdfunded for it for around a year, and we also supplemented it with money from our general fund because it took a lot longer to investigate than we anticipated. The actual investigation took over 6 months because the FOI process was quite drawn out and required 30 emails to some institutions to get responses. But in the end, after around 6 months, we got responses from all universities and ITs to a number of questions that we put to them. And we had 3 articles initially, and then a follow-up article on PhDs as well. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we find in the investigation, and then also for PhDs, because that's probably, and postgraduate researchers is probably what you're most interested in. So the first article was on precarity for lecturers and researchers, and it just highlighted the detrimental impact of casual and fixed term contracts are having on people working in the sector. And this is a quote from one of the first articles, just showing the poor wages that people had, that someone's son who was working in Duns was getting more money than them, even though they obviously were highly qualified. I'm not saying people in Duns aren't, but they had a PhD and things like that. So we found that an average of over 11,200 lecturers were working on a temporary or casual basis across the HEIs that answered us. We didn't receive answers from them all, costing an average of over 67 million each year. And we also found that this was fairly consistent in most universities and ITs every year, which showed that there was a space there for the lecturers. It wasn't kind of filling in or sudden increase or sudden decrease in most cases. And we also looked at CIDs. So this was one of the biggest issues. So we talked to over 30 people for this investigation. When I say we, it was me. I'm used to saying we when I'm talking about the already. But I talked to over 30 people, and the most common issue identified was CID. So this is contract of indefinite duration. It's normally for lecturers awarded after 4 years of continuous employment. It depends on your contract and that kind of thing. But there were huge issues with this, and I was speaking to people who had been working in lecturers maybe for 10 years or more without CIDs, and we found that 440 academic staff in universities and ITs were in continuous employment in excess of 2 years, but not in a CID. Apologies, it's 2 years for lecturers, it's 4 years for other staff. It's been a few months since I looked at this, but it's 2 years for lecturers. The other thing that we found was there's no central record of complaints about employment. And I suppose this is kind of something that you're highlighting there in terms of, and we also found that in terms of PhDs and teaching and things like that, that there wasn't really any central record held in the university of complaints about these things, or even time logs and things like that. So I suppose that is something that you've highlighted there in your manifesto. I suppose one of the other things, both at all levels of university, we found that there was pushback from colleagues and a sense of letting the side down when people highlighted these issues. And I suppose we highlighted a case in UCC where precarity was highlighted, and the campaign kind of subsequently disbanded because of they didn't feel supported and things like that. So I suppose that's something I suppose to be aware of, that you can get pushback for these kind of things. And one of the things, again, that might interest PhDs is a lot of the problems we found stemmed from sometimes an unclear relationship between a student and an employee. So a lot of the lecturers we saw would have maybe started lecturing as PhDs and then continued maybe when they did their postgrad, and then maybe continued after that. So they mightn't have ever had a contract, or they mightn't have ever had fixed hours or things like that. So it kind of, some of the unions were saying to us that this often stems from kind of a more casual basis of lecturing and things, perhaps on unpaid hours at the start, and then continuing when they actually finish their PhD. So that is something I suppose to keep in mind. So another article we did was looking at gender and disability and various backgrounds and how this also impacts on precarity. And as you can see from this graph, there's more women in part-time and kind of precarious work in academia, and this has been increasing in recent years as well. And almost 60% of permanent full-time academic roles are held by men. So I suppose it shows that there are big issues in this area. And we, Dr. Teresa O'Keefe is a great researcher in this area in UCC, and she highlighted kind of how precarious workers are often stuck on a hamster wheel of precarity, which I thought was a great phrase, and also how women often get trapped in the most exploitative forms of precarious work. So things like admin, they mightn't get to do research, and they're kind of trapped in kind of the housework of academia is how she put it. And we also looked at people with disabilities and spoke to people who said that one of the major hurdles is accessing funding, and this is partly to do with PhDs. And we found that currently there's the 7.1% of undergrads have a disability, but it dropped to 2.4% of postgrad. So that was one of the latest statistics on that. But yeah, like when you're looking at PhDs and funding, like people with disabilities can take longer to do a PhD, their funding might run out. And also if you're expected to give lectures and tutorials and write papers on top of that, and perhaps have absences due to sickness that aren't accounted for because of sick leave and things like that, again, it adds up more pressure and perhaps prevents access to PhDs for people with disabilities. And finally, in our third and fourth articles, we looked at issues for PhDs, and there were commonalities in a lot of higher education institutes that we looked at. We asked for FOIs on unpaid teaching, and I'm going to show you, you can actually look at your local higher education institute and see what they said to us. But I suppose one of the biggest things was stipends and funding for PhDs. And we looked at this across a number of universities and ITs. And also we had an advertisement actually for Trinity for a PhD back in 2007. That I have to confess that was actually during when I was doing science back in Trinity, and it was advertised to me back in the day. And it was a stipend of €18,000 per annum. And we found that the same institute was advertising a PhD last year for €18,500 per annum. So not a very high increase in over 10 years, well, maybe 15 years in terms of inflation and things like that. So there does seem to be a kind of a stagnation on stipends from what we found, and people even in the same institute being funded maybe for 13,000 or 20,000, depending on the scholarship they got. And I know that you were also, the group was looking at comparisons to Sweden, and we looked at the Swedish system where there are employees, and we calculated that they were paid a salary of 31,000 to 34,000, which was approximately 24,000 to 27,000 after tax. So it is actually even more than maybe our current stipends, and they also have a lower cost of living there. So I suppose it does show that the various differences across the EU. And so this was, I suppose, the main work we did in terms of PhDs. In terms of the FOIs, we asked for people's policies on unpaid teaching and other activities, and also the number of students that were undertaking unpaid teaching in institutes. And for most institutes, we got very little response in terms of numbers, mainly because they told us they didn't keep records on PhD teaching because they weren't classed as employees. So again, that is kind of something that the manifesto seems to address. But as you can see, we put together this table. So this actually is in our article, and you can search by institute what their response was, what their policy is in terms of unpaid teaching. But we actually found that most institutes had a policy of unpaid teaching for either as part of your PhD stipend or scholarship, with the exception of TU Dublin didn't have this requirement, and also there were some ITs that had it maybe in their policy but didn't implement it, so people didn't actually have to do unpaid teaching. And then a number of universities didn't answer particular questions, but from people who had contacted us and spoke to us, it does seem to be kind of across many universities and ITs in Ireland that there is unpaid teaching required. And brilliant, like it was brilliant response to this investigation. It was raised in the Dáil multiple times and in the Seanad, and also Minister Harris actually in December thanked us for it, so he was aware of it as well. And I think since then there have been meetings with various people and responses, but obviously in terms of PhDs, I've been contacted multiple times since this went out last year of people in different situations, and so there does seem to be an ongoing issue with PhDs. And the last thing we looked at is we looked at the Researcher Career Development and Employment Framework. So that was launched just towards the end of last year, published by the Irish Universities Association, and it doesn't include postgraduate researchers, so the PhD cohort. And we just have a quote from SIP2 there saying that there's nothing in the framework to address problems for PhD students, things like sick leave, holidays, or maternity leave. So it is something, again, that still needs to be addressed as far as I know. And finally, I just wanted to again bring up the fact that we're a crowd-sourced investigation site. So if you do have any ideas of things that you think we should be looking into, you can, this noteworthy.ie/entry, and you can let us know, or just email me. My email is on Twitter, but we're always looking for ideas for investigations. And thanks again for having me on. And any questions, obviously, at the end or whatever.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Maria. That was brilliant. And yeah, it's great to hear that the minister as well has seen it and responded to it. So yeah, it's great to have that highlighted. And yeah, it was a brilliant series all around. So thank you so much for presenting that here today. And yes, if anyone has any questions, just pop them in the chat and we can ask them to Maria after Eddie. So our next speaker is Eddie Conlon. Eddie is a lecturer in the School of Multidisciplinary Technologies at TUD, but he's also a trade union activist and a long-time member of the Teachers Union of Ireland. So I'll pass it on to Eddie now.
Okay, thanks, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Just to say a couple of things about myself first. So I work at TU Dublin. I've been working there since 1988. I started as a lowly part-time teacher at the time, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. I'm now working at the school with the terrible name that you mentioned twice there. And but I'm also part of a research group called CREATE, which is focused on, we do research around technological education mainly. I just thought I'd say three things really. Just talk a little bit about the general position of PhDs, and then perhaps, I mean, Maria's articles are really good. I read them all over the last week, but I think I want to introduce a slight note, a bit more of an optimistic note, and argue actually that if you start to disaggregate what Maria has found, the problems are less widespread in the sector I work in, and I would argue that because it's more unionized. And then I want to talk about maybe how we can use unions to progress some of these agendas that we want to progress here. I've been involved in the TUI as well since 1988, since I joined the institute as it was then, DIT. I've held every position across the union. I was on the national executive for 8 years. I was the first non-permanent lecturer to be on the national executive, and I fought many battles within the union, which I'll also refer to. But just to say, in a general sense, and and just dealing with PhD students and so on, their lot has become considerably worse over time. And I mean, I don't need to repeat all the points you've made, but as well as doing research and teaching, we now have things like additional requirements for professional development. So our students are required to take up 40 credits of modules, as well as doing their research and doing the teaching that they might be doing. And it seems to me, the demands being placed on PhD students in terms of, or I won't call you students, sorry, in terms of people doing PhDs, the demands that have been placed on you are increasing over time. And there is some confusion, I think, actually, about what it is we're doing or asking PhD students to do. I mean, traditionally, we saw it as a training for research, but increasingly, we want you to be many things, have excellent communication skills, to be great group workers, team players, and all these other things. So it seems to me over time, more and more is being asked of you. And I think that's very problematic. I support the general idea that you should have employee status, right? I think the research that's been done across but certainly in my own institute, the research that's been done by PhD candidates is certainly of significance and and sometimes of a quality better than what later career researchers are doing. So I think we need to value that, and acknowledge the value that that has, and don't see it as a cheap way of getting important research done. And I think that's important in this debate, that we acknowledge the significant new knowledge that PhD candidates generate in the course of doing their work. Now, Maria, as I mentioned there, my institute, it's not my institute, the institute I work in doesn't require people to do teaching as part of their stipend. And I think that's really important, because I think that allows the institutions that Maria's referred to, that you referred to, conflate your position as a student, as they would see it, and as a worker, and therefore raises all sorts of problems in terms of collective bargaining, the right to collective bargaining, and so on. So we need, as an initial demand, to demand that no teaching requirements be included as part of any stipend that a student would get. And if students teach, they should be treated as other workers who teach are in the institutions that we work in. Now, if you look at Maria's data, it is depressing, right? And I think the problems you're trying to address are inextricably linked with the problem of casualization and precariety, right? So it's right to discuss that issue in the context of this debate. But if you do look at the numbers, and even if you look, the Cush report was done in 2016, which was a report that was done looking at whether the period of time that people would have to work to get a contract of indefinite duration should be reduced. Even the Cush report backs up sort of what's in Maria's data, showing a considerably lower level, I would argue, of casualization in what was the Institute of Technology sector than you find in the traditional universities. So, for example, Cush found that about 25% of the workers in the IoT sectors could be described as casual. I don't need to go into the detail of all the different categories, but it was about 45% in the universities. In relation to the issue Maria raised there in relation to people who should have CIDs and don't have them, she found, I think the answer from our place was 31, but it was 70 from Trinity and 140 from UCD. So there are considerable differences, I would argue, in the institutions. Now, I'm not attempting here by any means whatsoever to defend TU Dublin, right? I spent my life fighting the management in TU Dublin, but to make the point, I think, that it's because the environment in institutes of technology are much more heavily unionized that we can account for these figures on that basis. So it is significant, for example. There is a legal requirement for a contract of indefinite duration after 4 years, but actually through negotiation and through getting the CUSH thing established and putting pressure on, it has now been reduced to 2 years in higher education. That's a significant achievement. Now, whether people have the contracts or not, at least it's a basis for fighting for them, right? And that's probably where the problem comes in. In some cases, the unions don't fight hard enough for people who should have these things. So in our place, there's no requirement to teach. If you teach as a PhD candidate, you get paid the same hourly rate as a lecturer who coming in to do casual hours from anywhere else. After 2 years, you can get a CID. You also, and this was a really important aspect of the CUSH report, it established a process by which if additional teaching hours became available in your discipline, they have to be sort of allocated internally in the first instance. They have to ask people who are doing this work already, are they available and do they want to teach them? So you can accrue additional hours. And then after 3 years, you have an entitlement to apply for a pro rata contract. Now, I don't know why the union ever agreed to that. I'm not centrally involved in the union anymore, but the requirement in law is part-time workers should not be treated any less favorably than whole-time workers. So I don't actually understand. I've been talking to colleagues today about it, how the union ever agreed to a 3-year waiting period for a pro rata contract. Now, while these things are not specifically focused on postgrads, right, they do help, right? And they do at least provide a structure where you can go in and demand things like a CID, a pro rata contract, and if you have pro rata contract, then issues to do with increments, pensions, and so on are beginning to be addressed. So I think that's important, and these things are important. And the reason why they're there is because the union was made to fight for them. And this is my last point, really. But the union didn't always do that, right? When I joined the TUI in 1988, right, as a part-time lecturer, I said I wanted to join the union because that's just the kind of person I am, inclined to be active in things. They said to me, there's not very much we can do for you, you might be wasting your money, right? But over time, by organizing within the union, by persuading full-time workers, and this is crucial, it seems to me, in this discussion, how you as a group relate to and engage with the full-time staff, we persuaded enough people in the union that casualization was a big problem. We should be taken into full membership. Eventually, we had a scheme where I became what you call an eligible part-time teacher, which is what you'd have called a pro rata contract now. And eventually, I was made permanent, all through processes of negotiation and fighting along the way, right? So you have to make this an issue for the unions, it seems to me, right? And joining a union, I would argue, is a good first step, but it's not enough. We have to make sure the pressure is kept up, and certainly I'm prepared to help in any way whatsoever, and I'm sure the TUI branch in TU Dublin would certainly be open to working with you in whatever way we can to help you progress your agenda. But the key thing over time, as I said, was to make it an issue for the union and get enough whole-time workers working with you on these issues. So this is a great initiative, right? I think you're absolutely right to raise this. I think there's way too much pressure on postgrads in terms of all the various things they're being asked to do. And I think the unions have a responsibility to do something about it. We need to get rid of this conflation of your role. You're essentially working. When you're teaching, you're certainly working. So there should be no confusion about what you're doing. And you should have the same rights and entitlements as other workers, as I've argued for here. So I look forward to the discussion and the questions, and fair play to you for taking this initiative.
Cheers, Eddie. Thanks so much for that. That was brilliant. And yeah, just to hear those points. And I think you provided a few reassurances there for members of the group as well to hear how you organise within your union as well. I might just, before the questions, just do a quick recap of the talks, and then we'll get into the questions. I'll just take the questions in order in the chat here. Yeah, so I suppose Maria, brilliant, did a brilliant investigation. She's highlighted casualization in our universities, although Eddie has pointed out that casualization isn't as rampant in the ITs as it is our universities. However, we can see the reliance on casualized work in our universities, and we see discrimination when it comes to disabilities. Maria rightly pointed out that scholarships for PhDs and for teaching work don't take into account the issues that people with disabilities face, which is quite frankly ridiculous. And we saw the case actually of Catherine Gallagher earlier in the year, actually, with regards to her stipend. Also, Maria pointed out actually the stagnant stipends over the last 10 years. So stipends, I'm pretty sure for the IRC didn't change. It was only this year the IRC stipend changed, and I think the last time it changed was about 2006. So yeah, 15 years the stipend hadn't changed for the IRC, which is just ridiculous. Yeah, and then she pointed out the issues affecting PhDs and how they are workers but not given worker status. Um, and also the issue of no record keeping as well on PhDs in the universities as well. And then Eddie rightly points out that unionization can help combat these issues, like he's mentioned about casualization not being as rampant in our ITs. Things have been made worse because of these new structured PhDs where you're expected to take on additional credits, which a lot of the time don't really serve any kind of purpose for the PhD. It's just kind of a check in the box exercise for professional development. Um, and that universities should really acknowledge a PhD's work, that it is work. PhDs are conducting research. I mean, the government are happy to highlight PhD research when it comes good all over the news, etc., but aren't willing to pay for it, essentially. Um, and that no teaching should be required as part of our stipends. And I think that's bang on. I think we saw the incident in NUIG this year where PhDs were required to do a ridiculous number of hours of additional teaching, not paid on top of their PhDs. Um, yeah, and the Cush report can help as well. And the issue with the unions, which will I'm sure there's been a few questions actually about that, where initially where Eddie approached them and they didn't actually help initially or told them that it's no good, but by organising within the union and putting pressure, they eventually won their case. So I suppose we'll go to the questions now.
I might just, while you're picking out questions, I just, because Eddie raised a few points, I'll just, I suppose one of the things, you're very right about ITs, like during the investigation, far less people contacted us about conditions within ITs. There were some, but it didn't seem to be as much of an issue, if you know what I mean. Like there were some issues, obviously, but not on the scale as universities. I suppose in terms of like ITs and TU Dublin, like there is a pay agreement with TUI, whereas it seems to be a lot harder with universities because they're independent and there isn't kind of one pay agreement within all the universities. So that is a challenge that we came across. And then in terms of the Cush report, I suppose one thing to note about that, it doesn't apply to researchers. So if you're only a researcher, it's still 4 years. So I suppose that was a huge issue we found in researchers who are on continuous kind of contracts and postdocs and things like that. Sorry, back to you, Tom.
But just to say on that, I was told today that there are discussions taking place about researcher contracts at the moment. Indeed, when I was on the executive of the union some years ago, researchers started to join the union and started to raise issues, particularly about their pensions, which is really problematic. And to be honest, it didn't really go anywhere, I'd have to say. But I believe now there are talks taking place. The difficulties for researchers, as you know, is funding runs out. So we need to find some mechanism by which people can be continued on and move, essentially move from, not essentially move themselves, but that there's some continuity from them between grants, and that they're recognised as a continuous form of employment. And I also think that would help you guys if there was some progress on the general position of researchers. Well, I'm not quite sure if these talks refer to the university as well, but certainly another talks going on in relation to institutes, and I include TU Dublin in that because we're broadly part of that. But just to make the point that there's a real risk, actually, this is just the last intervention, the real risk that as TUs develop, that national framework that Maria talked about, which has been really important for us in trying to contain some of these issues, is going to start to break up. So TU Dublin has joined the Irish Universities Association. It's not involved in the same block anymore as the other institutes of technology, and there could be a degree of fragmentation which won't help us.
Yeah, and I'd probably just add to that. Yeah, you are right. There is a negotiation going on with the Department of Higher Ed at the moment about research contracts for early career researchers, I'm pretty sure. But as far as I'm aware, the key stakeholders are actually being left in the cold in terms of those conversations. I think it's mostly the department talking to the IUA on them, and not including. There's a few research staff associations. I think there's an Irish Research Staff Association now who are involved, but not to the degree they should be. So just to say that as well. I'll just press on to the questions. So first question here is for Maria. So in your view, should more funding, such as what has recently been announced by Simon Harris, be diverted to improving the material conditions of work in academia?
Yeah, so he has announced obviously hundreds of millions for research over the last few months. I suppose the thing that we came across when we were doing the investigation is that, like, obviously this funding is great, but perhaps a simple solution would be terms and conditions to have higher stipends or better conditions. So when they're giving out the funding, instead of spreading it as thinly as they can for as many people as they can, perhaps to have conditions within the funding, if they're giving it to institutions, to have a certain level that they have to reach, or a minimum level of funding per person or per PhD or something like that, or that. So I think like that could be a solution that was proposed during the investigation that could be effective, but I haven't seen it yet in terms of the funding that has been announced.
Okay. And another question here for you, Maria. Did you find that the workers you spoke to during your investigation recall other resistance to precarity in their institutions?
Yeah, so I know I mentioned UCC, but it was common across many people I spoke to. I suppose most of the people I spoke to were in temporary or hourly contracts or part-time contracts, so they wouldn't have had, they most likely didn't have a permanent role, and most were afraid to speak without being anonymised, and some had resistance within institutes. So it would have been quite a common experience among kind of the temporary workers, and they did call on their permanent colleagues to stand up for them rather than them having to speak out, because it is so. I suppose you are at risk. I suppose if you are not on a permanent contract, if you speak out on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another question here for both of you, actually. Could the speakers comment on the potential for postgrad workers groups like the PGWA to collaborate with other precarious academic workers to fight precarity in general? And is there scope for a coalition? So I'll just pass it over to Eddie first, actually.
Yes, is the simple answer to that. I mean, the as I sort of argued, that I think it's the general precarity across the sector that's creating some of the problems that you're facing, right? For example, the non-acknowledgement of your teaching and so on. It's attempted to cheapen teaching, which is what's been driving the agenda for a very long time. So yes, but the issue becomes how you build these coalitions, and I think we need to start off from the premise that uh, while whole time and perhaps more senior staff and so on can be difficult to win around, they can be won around, And I think it's perhaps a question of how we go about doing that. And I think, you see, universities are a great place for organizing big workplaces. There's lots of spaces to have meetings and so on. People are online and so on and so forth. So I think we just need to have sort of creative thoughts about having events which bring this issue to the whole time staff who have the real power. Because I see a lot of questions coming in here about backlash and so on, and people do get afraid and people do get worried it's going to hurt their careers and so on and so forth. But you need a sort of shield around you to help you with that stuff. And I think the best shield is the whole time staff as a body helping you to do something about this. So I think events. There should be events, perhaps across in each university, drawing attention to the growing precarity, inviting the unions to send speakers along to it, so that it's seen to be a common endeavour, in the first instance. So it's not ye. A lot of this stuff is often perceived as ye giving out about the older staff because they're all cozy, and some of them are. Let's be honest. Somebody mentions PhD apathy here. There's also senior staff apathy because they're looking forward to retirement and so on. So you have to sort of break that cycle, and you do it by. I mean, I don't like to use some of this sort of meaningless words here, but you need to have dialogue with people about these things. You need to sort of engage with them. If you start from the premise that perhaps they're not going to be on your side, you're going to have a problem. People can be won around. And my own story, I mean, I don't want to, is a good example of how we did that. We actually turned the TUI to a serious focus on the issue of casualization, and then, which led to significant victories on it, I would say, over time. To the extent, for example, we had a major dispute. There was a process by which casual staff had accrued the right to a permanent position. The institute refused to appoint a whole number of people, and we had a ballot for industrial action, which was fully supported by all the staff. But that took years of work and dialogue, meetings, explaining to people how important it was, and getting people to understand as well that it undermines everyone's conditions actually if work is made more precarious. And I think they're the sort of things we could do. We should have meetings. I mean, I know we're moving into I don't know if we're moving into a post-COVID situation, right? But whatever we're moving into, we should be having meetings which draw together groups like yourselves, the unions and so on, into the same forums where they're discussing these things together. I think that's the initial step, perhaps, that needs to be taken.
Cheers. Do you have any comments on that, Maria, or?
I can't really comment on pushing you to unionize.
Fair enough. Yeah.
From a press, but but I suppose when I was doing the investigation, there was a push, but you organised this together.
I suppose one thing to say is, there is a research staff association as well that want to work with us. So I mean, that would be one great coalition partner to have. But also, I meant, like, just to highlight what you're saying there, Eddie. We saw the success in the campaign for the Department of Higher Education, where we had, I think there was a letter circulated, and it was researchers across Ireland, a lot of prominent researchers on that letter as well. So I think, definitely getting those on board as well is definitely something we should do and have dialogue with them. And as you said, our precarity affects them too. Having low stipends and poor conditions also affects their research work as well. So
absolutely,
definitely good to get them on board. I suppose just a question about the unions. Teresa has pointed out that unions have not always allowed postgraduate workers to be members, and we've experienced this ourselves. We've seen that when we approached IFUT, they just weren't willing to help us. So I suppose, could you expand on ways we can get, so this is from Connor, can you expand on ways we can get the unions to take our issues seriously, and how important it is to recruit other postgrads to the union?
Yeah, so I suppose I would have talked to all the unions about this particular, if they're allowing PhDs as members, and like I would definitely, because you're not classed as a staff member, weren't open to that. And yeah, so I suppose because you're staff class as students, I know that SIP2 are open to having members. I'm not sure, you probably know more about TUI, Eddie. But there is actually, it's not even just an issue. I know it's a big issue with PhD researchers, but it's a huge issue actually in general in terms of people on temporary contracts and hourly contracts, because it's very hard for unions to recruit them, and partly because of high union fees. I know IFUT are reducing union fees depending on salary, and there's other similar things in other unions. But in general, like a kind of more temporary workers and that find it hard to unionize, and also then find it hard to raise their issues. But like I suppose most PhD researchers are full time. You're not temporary. You're there for 4 years, so it would be an opportunity maybe to join unions. But that is an issue, especially in universities where IFUT would be the biggest union.
Yeah, and
In
actually
most, not in all, but in most universities.
yeah, and just on the
I think
point
this
of,
is an issue. I was trying to find my TUI rulebook there on the shelf behind me, but I couldn't put my hand on it. I think the TUI rulebook stipulates that you have to be teaching to be a member of the TUI, right? So that would seem to be a problem from the start. So we could look at what you might need to do about that. But if you are teaching, right, you can join the union. We do have postgrads who are teaching, right? As because they're doing some teaching for which they're getting paid, that allows them to join the union. And for the TUI, you can join for €1 for the first year, right? Which I think is a good initiative, actually, right? I'm not always praising the union for the things they do. They do some things very badly, right? But that's a very good initiative to reduce the fee to €1. But they're probably I know there's been some discussion about what the basis of membership of the TUI. As far as I recollect off the top of my head, it does say you have to be doing teaching, right? So that could be problematic. But I have to say, in the past, the unions didn't really welcome part-timers. Certainly, I know I didn't necessarily welcome part-timers in the past. The TUI wasn't great, as I said. But we have to change that sort of culture and get people to understand that the work is changing anyway. The nature of what we're doing, is changing, which is probably why this was an obvious point to make. The volume of research in the institutes of technology has been behind the universities traditionally. It's beginning to increase, and so these problems are going to multiply across the sector as that happens. So we may have to look at that again. But certainly, there may be a barrier there to join as a postgrad, right? But certainly, if you're teaching, there shouldn't be any issue about you joining the TUI. As it says, it's only €1. I actually wrote down the fees there earlier on. Yeah, if you're teaching 5 to 9 hours, it's about €8 a month then after the first year. So, they're not usually prohibitive fees. I'm in favour of low fees. But there may be something in the rule book that might need to change.
absolutely. I'm just conscious of the time here, so I'll just do two more questions, I think. So I suppose these two questions actually link together. So a question from Quiva here. So if you could comment on how to handle backlash from higher level staff regarding making our demands laid out in the charter. And so I suppose something that kind of links in with that is DJ's question, which is any recommendations on combating PhD research apathy, as in getting PhDs to get involved. So I suppose if they fear backlash, they're less likely to get involved as well. So I suppose Eddie, if you want to comment on that.
Right. Well, I've already forgotten the first question. Sorry. Could you?
So the first question was just from Quiva, and she just wants to know if you could comment on how to handle potential backlash from higher level staff.
There's no simple answer to that question. Other than some of the things I said earlier on, you have to have an open dialogue. You have to bring staff into forums where you're discussing these things together. and where you get the demands aren't on them. You see, you know what I mean. The demands you're making aren't on them; they're on the institute that you work in. And as I said, precarity doesn't benefit anybody. It actually makes everyone's job harder. You know, I just know from my own experience. You know, dealing with part timers, you know, especially if they're working with you and so on. You know, people changing from year to year is a serious problem because you know they don't have guaranteed employment and so on. So these create additional problems for academics who are working away. You only combat apathy if you are clear, and I think you've been very clear, I have to say, in identifying first of all what the problem is you're trying to solve, right? And secondly, then making people believe you can do something about it. People aren't going to buy up to your campaign, it seems to me, or buy into it if you can't begin to demonstrate clear pathways in terms of things you're going to do to move things forward. Because as you know, I mean, a lot of people come into research or you know thinking they're going to get an academic career out of it. They have a very individualistic orientation and so on. But you know that doesn't often lead people very far. I think you need to, as I said, identify the problem clearly. And I think, as I said, you've done that really well in your charter. And I also think, you know, if you could, you know, have clear programs of action, things you're going to get people to do, but do them together. And that's the other thing that gets around the apathy and the backlash. Do them in as big a numbers as possible so people don't feel isolated.
Cheers. Yeah, absolutely. Cheers for that, Eddie. I suppose just one comment to wrap up on, and it's from myself actually. It's just for Maria. So I suppose it's just about you highlighted the case in Sweden, and I think it's about 7 other EU EEA countries that have this system in place that recognises postgraduates who work and PhDs who work as workers, with contracts of employment. And actually, just to point out that in Ireland as well, if you're on certain funding, I don't know if you've highlighted this in your article, Maria, that if you're on, say, a Marie Curie fellowship, you're actually regarded as a worker. And the same goes if you've done a degree in medicine, say, and you go on to do a PhD, you're a fellow, you are not a PhD, but you're still effectively doing the same work as a PhD. But I suppose the question I have is, the EU, I mean, the countries that do have workers' rights for PhDs, those countries also happen to be the research leaders in the EU when you look at ERC grants. I suppose, do you think there's, in Ireland, do you think we just look too far inward, I suppose? Do you think there's a bit of naivety in terms of actually, who are our research competitors? It's not just between institutions in Ireland, it's also with the EU institutions, and that PhDs, if conditions get so bad that it's just unfeasible to do work here. We had the case in Trinity where a stipend was offered for 13 grand for 3 years, 3 of the 4 years, and the PhD had to get funded for the rest. Do you think it's the case that PhDs will just eventually just have enough and up sticks and go to Europe, who are offering far better rates, I suppose?
Yeah, that it is a good point. I suppose if people kind of look around and see, like the PhD numbers have been fairly static. They haven't really decreased or anything in recent years, even though, as you're saying, the conditions have gotten worse. But in terms of the research, and as you like we were saying that maybe research is better, or like better outcomes and things, like it could tie in with what I was saying, where this kind of people maybe not being on contracts and this kind of unclear terms, because you start working as a PhD with unpaid contracts or unpaid teaching and stuff like that, and you're not really registered with HR, and you're not, they mightn't even know that you exist, and then it keeps going for years, and after your PhD, and it kind of goes on like that, and then you have these kind of unclear terms and hourly contracts and temporary things and things like that manifesting. Like I was talking to someone at a university who actually that happened to, where they had started working as a PhD and they ended up not really having a contract actually after around 8 years of teaching, until they realized, oh, I should be on a CID, and then HR were like, well, you don't even have your original contract. So it's these kind of things that maybe are manifesting in our universities and institutions, and that could then have an impact on our research environment and things like that. So I suppose if you're starting off at the PhD level, like in Sweden, where people are employees, it's clearer, everything is kind of on board and in contracts and with benefits and things like that from the start. So it might improve things that way.
Cheers. Thanks so much, Maria. Yeah, and I suppose we better wrap it up there. I know we've gone a bit over time now, but just I suppose thanks to both Maria and Eddie for joining us this evening. I know it's good weather outside, so thanks for taking the evening. And thanks to everyone who's joined the stream this evening as well, and for all the questions. We have like tons of questions there, so yeah, I mean, like, do send them in actually to us, and we'll try and follow up on them because some of them are really good. But yeah, just thanks again to everyone. And look, if you're interested involved in getting involved in our campaign, you know, we have our 4 member branches in TCD, UCD, NUIG, and UCC. So please contact them. But if not, we would love to expand to other universities across the country. As Eddie says, it's about getting organised and getting more people involved, and we need to have a presence on all the campuses. So please do get in contact with us, and most importantly, sign the petition. So I think the link has been posted up on our Twitter, and it's on the coalition page, member Twitter page as well. So please do sign that petition. And yeah, we look forward to building the campaign over the summer and into next year, and hopefully, I mean, we've got good momentum so far, and we've seen questions in the doll. So hopefully, we can continue this and you know, keep the issue highlighted in the media as well. So thanks everyone, and thanks again to our speakers. Cheers.